The story begins in Naples at the start of the 20th century, a city of beauty and decay pressed against the Mediterranean Sea. Tourists saw sunlight on the water and cobblestone streets winding like veins through ancient neighborhoods. But for those born into the crowded alleys, Naples was no postcard. It was a place where hunger gnawed, where the Camorra whispered in the dark, and where a child's future was often decided before he could read his own name. Into this world came Vito Genovese. He was born in 1897, in a cramped room where plaster peeled from the walls and the air was thick with the smell of damp stone. His family had little. His father worked as best he could, but work was scarce and wages were thin. His mother kept the household together with scraps of food and endless patience. They were not unique. Thousands lived the same way, stacked in tight quarters, sharing wells and bread, praying they would not be the ones crushed under poverty's weight. Vito was small, wiry, with sharp eyes that always seemed older than his years. He grew up among the noise of markets, the cries of vendors, and the squabbles of children fighting over scraps. From the beginning, he learned that nothing came without a struggle. If you wanted a piece of bread, you had to shove. If you wanted to be heard, you had to shout. And if you wanted respect, you had to show you weren't afraid. The Camorra, Naples' old criminal society, was everywhere. Men whispered names like prayers and curses, speaking of figures who moved money, who settled disputes with knives, who made law where no government could reach. For a boy like Vito, their presence was both terrifying and magnetic. They had power. They had respect. Even the police stepped aside for them. Vito noticed. He absorbed. But before ambition there was hunger. Hunger carved deep into him, shaping his early days. His father sometimes returned home empty-handed, his eyes cast down. His mother would stretch beans into soup, bread into crumbs, making the little they had last. Vito learned what it meant to want, to ache for more, and to see that others had it while you did not. It was in those streets that Vito first saw what violence could achieve. Fights broke out constantly over territory, over insults, over pride. He saw boys bloodied in alleys, men cut down in disputes that began as whispers. And what stayed with him was not the fear, but the result. Violence ended arguments. It silenced doubt. It changed the balance of power in a heartbeat. He began to understand that fists and blades were not just tools of anger. They were tools of survival. One story, told years later, described Vito as a boy no older than 10, cornered by older children. They mocked him, pushed him, demanding he give up the bread his mother had sent him to buy. Instead of crying or fleeing, he lashed out with a rock. One boy fell, blood streaming from his forehead. The others fled. Vito returned home with the bread intact, his eyes burning not with guilt, but with a strange sense of triumph. He had learned that fear was a kind of armor. By his early teens, he no longer needed to be told that the streets were unforgiving. He had seen men dragged from their homes for debts they could not pay. He had seen women cry over husbands who never returned. He had seen funerals become routine, black veils blending into the city like shadows. And in all of it, he learned one truth. No one was coming to save you. If you wanted protection, you made it yourself. His father, weary and beaten down by endless struggle, spoke of America. He had heard stories from neighbors who had crossed the ocean, tales of jobs, of streets bustling with opportunity, of a place where even the poor could rise. For him, America was escape. For young Vito, the idea stirred something deeper. Not escape, but challenge. A new world where he could prove himself, where no one would overlook him, where he could carve his name into the very heart of the city. In 1913, the Genovese family left Naples. They carried little more than clothes, a few belongings, and hope folded into their pockets. The voyage across the Atlantic was long and brutal. Third-class passengers crowded into narrow quarters below deck, the air heavy with sweat and seasickness. Children cried in the night. Mothers whispered prayers. Fathers stared into the dark, wondering if the promise of America was worth the risk. Vito, 16 years old, stood on the deck as the ship neared New York Harbor. The passengers pressed forward, craning their necks to glimpse the figure that rose from the water, the Statue of Liberty. For most, it was a symbol of freedom, a beacon of hope. But for Vito, it was something else. He didn't see freedom. He saw a giant standing guard, daring him to step ashore. It was not welcome, it was a challenge. When the ship docked at Ellis Island, the Genovese family joined the endless line of immigrants waiting to be processed. Doctors examined them like livestock. Officials asked questions in languages many could barely understand. Some families were turned back. Their dreams ended in a single word: denied. But the Genovese passed through, carrying their names, their hopes, and their burdens into America. They settled in Little Italy, a crowded corner of Manhattan where the language of Naples still clung to every doorway. The streets smelled of bread and garlic, but also of sweat and poverty. Tenement buildings towered above narrow alleys where children played stickball and where men with sharp suits and sharper eyes lingered on corners. It was a place where the old country lived inside the new, where immigrants survived by clinging together and by watching for threats that never stopped coming. For Vito, it was both familiar and new. The hunger, the cramped rooms, the fights, it was Naples all over again. But there was also a sense of possibility. The city pulsed with energy, with wealth, with people who had found ways to climb higher. He watched men step out of expensive cars, their shoes polished, their jackets lined with silk. He listened to neighbors whispering about men of respect, men who made problems disappear, men who carried themselves with untouchable confidence. He recognized the same patterns he had seen in Naples. Respect was bought with fear. Power was taken, not given. And here in America, those who took it seemed to live like kings. Vito was no longer a boy. He was a teenager standing at the edge of a world that would test him, shape him, and demand he choose who he wanted to be. Already, he knew one thing for certain. He would never live with his father's quiet resignation. He would never bow his head, waiting for scraps. He had tasted hunger. He had felt the sting of weakness. And he would not feel it again. In the crowded alleys of Little Italy, with the Statue of Liberty still etched in his mind, Vito Genovese took his first steps into the city that would make him, and eventually break him. Little Italy in the 1910s was a place of noise and survival. The streets were narrow, lined with pushcarts selling fruit, fish, and bread. Vendors shouted prices in Italian, children darted between stalls, and the air smelled of roasted chestnuts mixed with coal smoke from the tenements. To outsiders, it might have seemed lively, almost festive. But for those who lived there, every day was a battle against poverty, prejudice, and the weight of a country that did not welcome them easily. The Genovese family crammed into a tenement building on Elizabeth Street. The ceilings leaked when it rained. The walls were thin enough to hear neighbors arguing, and the heat in summer was suffocating. Yet compared to the hunger of Naples, there was at least bread on the table and occasional work to be found. For Vito's father, America was survival. For Vito, it was not enough. As a teenager, Vito grew restless. He watched men in suits with rings on their fingers and hats tipped just right. They moved through Little Italy with confidence, their pockets full, their names spoken with both respect and fear. These were the street bosses, the men tied to the Mafia. They did not beg for work or bow to landlords. They controlled the gambling dens, the loans, the very air people breathed in the neighborhood. Vito admired them, but admiration quickly became hunger. He wanted what they had: money, respect, power. School was never his path. He skipped classes, preferring to run errands on the streets. Teachers saw him as another immigrant boy destined for factory work. But Vito was already planning for more. His first real lessons came in the alleys, where boys formed gangs of their own. They fought over corners, defended pride with fists, and sometimes carried knives tucked in belts. Vito quickly proved himself tougher than most. He wasn't the biggest, but he was fearless, willing to swing first and hardest. Fear, he discovered, worked as well on boys his age as it did on grown men. The police were a constant presence, but not as protectors. Patrolmen treated Italian immigrants with disdain, often shaking down shopkeepers for bribes or cracking skulls in the street. Vito learned early that the law was not on his side. When he was caught stealing apples from a cart, The officer didn't take him to a station. He slapped him across the face, called him a slur, and shoved him into the gutter. The lesson was clear. The law would never respect him. If he wanted protection, he would have to find it elsewhere. And that protection came from the men he had been watching, the local Mafia crew. They controlled gambling in the backrooms, protection rackets for stores, and even the pushcarts. They noticed Vito, the skinny boy who never backed down. At first, he ran small errands, delivering packages, carrying messages, keeping an eye out for police during games of dice in alleyways. For a boy barely out of childhood, it was intoxicating. He had purpose. He was part of something larger. His mother worried. She begged him to find honest work, to stay away from the men in sharp suits. But Vito had already made up his mind. Honest work paid pennies. Honest work bowed to bosses who sneered at immigrants. The men she feared walked the streets with heads held high. That was the life he wanted. By 16, Vito was running with older boys in the neighborhood, stealing goods off trucks, selling stolen liquor, and shaking down shopkeepers. Violence came naturally to him. He did not hesitate when a message needed to be sent with fists or worse. Stories spread about the young Genovese boy who would not hesitate to swing a bat or pull a knife. Some saw recklessness. Others saw potential. Law enforcement pressure grew as the Mafia expanded, but corruption softened the blows. Vito saw police look the other way after envelopes exchanged hands. He understood the game. The law could be bought, bent, and twisted. Respecting it was optional. Controlling it was the real goal. Yet even among criminals, trust was thin. Rival gangs prowled Little Italy, Irish crews clashing with Italians, disputes over territories spilling into bloodshed. Vito's early years were filled with street fights that ended with broken bones or worse. He learned not just to strike but to plan, choosing when to attack, when to step back, when to let fear do the work instead of fists. The Prohibition era was only a few years away, but already whispers spread about the fortune illegal liquor would bring. Men around Vito were preparing, setting up routes, bribing police, and planning territories. Vito was still too young to run his own operation, but he was learning the lessons that would carry him through the rest of his life. Fear was currency, violence was negotiation, and loyalty was everything, until it wasn't. One incident in particular marked him. A neighborhood bookmaker refused to pay his share to the crew Vito worked for. He thought the boy sent to collect was too young to be dangerous. Vito answered with a broken bottle across the man's face, leaving him bleeding on the floor. From that day, no one in Little Italy underestimated him again. The boy had crossed the line into manhood, and not with words, but with blood. At home, his father disapproved but lacked the strength to stop him. His mother's tears no longer reached him. Vito felt something powerful building inside him, a certainty that he was destined for more than tenement life. The law had no respect for his people. Honest jobs kept them poor. The Mafia gave him what the world denied: respect, power, money in his pocket, and fear in the eyes of others. By the time he turned 20, Vito was no longer a boy watching from the edges. He was part of the system, a trusted young soldier in the making. He had already tasted what it meant to command respect, and he wanted more. The streets had taught him brutal lessons, and he had absorbed every one of them. Trust was dangerous, mercy was weakness, and survival belonged to those willing to take what others feared to touch. But survival was only the beginning. For Vito Genovese, the hunger that started in Naples had grown into something larger. Little Italy had given him a place to sharpen his edges, but New York was vast, filled with opportunity. The men he served now, bosses, gamblers, gangsters, were powerful, yes. But he could already see their flaws, their hesitations. And in his mind, one truth grew louder every day. One day, he would not serve. One day, he would rule. The city around him was changing, the country itself on the edge of transformation. Soon Prohibition would arrive, opening doors to unimaginable wealth and bloodshed. Soon the Mafia would rise from street gangs into empires. And standing at the edge of it all, Vito Genovese was ready. He had been a boy in Naples, a hungry immigrant in Little Italy. Now he was a man with fists hardened by fights, eyes sharpened by ambition, and a soul already touched by violence. The lessons were clear. America was not a land of opportunity, it was a battlefield. And Vito had no intention of losing. The year was 1920, and America was about to change forever. The 18th Amendment had gone into effect, making the sale and production of alcohol illegal. What the government imagined would bring morality to the nation instead created a black market more profitable than anything the underworld had ever seen. Overnight, liquor turned into gold. For the men of Little Italy, the timing could not have been better. They already had networks of smuggling, protection, and gambling. Now they had something everyone wanted: booze. Restaurants, speakeasies, and nightclubs all needed suppliers. Police and politicians, many of them heavy drinkers themselves, were eager to look the other way as long as the right envelopes landed in their hands. The stage was set for a new kind of empire. Vito Genovese was 23, restless and hungry. He was no longer just a tough kid running errands. He had proven himself ruthless in collections and feared in the alleys. Now he was ready for something bigger. The streets were flooded with opportunity, and Vito was not about to let it pass him by. At first, he worked under older gangsters who handled bootlegging routes. Trucks loaded with Canadian whiskey or homemade gin rolled into New York every night, and Vito rode shotgun, keeping an eye out for hijackers. He quickly showed a talent not just for muscle but for calculation. He knew when to fight and when to bribe. More than once, he pulled a driver away from a police stop, slipping money into the officer's hand with a cold smile. He understood that power wasn't only about fists. Sometimes, a folded bill was sharper than a knife. But violence was never far away. Rival gangs fought for control of the lucrative liquor trade. Trucks were hijacked, warehouses torched, men gunned down in broad daylight. Vito thrived in the chaos. He carried a pistol at all times and was never shy about using it. In one infamous dispute over a shipment of whiskey, Vito supposedly pulled the trigger himself, sending a rival sprawling on the pavement. The story spread quickly. This was a man who wouldn't hesitate, a soldier who knew how to deliver results. The blood in the streets only made him rise faster. By the early 1920s, he was no longer just a hired hand. He was running his own crew, small but effective, making money through bootlegging and gambling. His reputation caught the attention of powerful men higher up, bosses like Joe Masuria, one of the most feared Mafia leaders in New York. Masuria was brutal, greedy, and feared across the city. He demanded tribute from all Italian gangs and used violence to enforce his will. For Vito, serving under him was both opportunity and danger. Opportunity, because Masuria's empire was vast, filled with money and connections. Danger, because Masuria's enemies were everywhere, plotting to cut him down. Law enforcement was watching, too. Prohibition agents raided speakeasies weekly, smashing barrels and arresting anyone they could grab. But corruption ran deeper than arrests. More often than not, those arrested walked free the next day, charges dropped, evidence misplaced. Vito saw how the system worked. Justice was flexible, and money bent it whichever way you wanted. He learned to keep cash ready not just for his men, but for judges, prosecutors, and anyone who could help keep him one step ahead of prison. Still, the streets never rested. The Italian gangs weren't united. Old rivalries from Sicily and Naples simmered in New York, feeding violence. By the late 1920s, tensions exploded into what became known as the Castellamarese War, a bloody conflict between Masuria and a rival faction led by Salvatore Maranzano. For men like Vito, this was baptism by fire. Murders happened daily. Men vanished, their bodies found days later in alleys or floating in the river. No one trusted anyone. Friends turned on friends, crews split apart, loyalty tested with every bullet fired. Vito fought on the side of Masuria, carrying out hits and defending territory. He was no longer just another soldier. He was becoming a trusted enforcer, the kind of man bosses relied on when subtlety failed and blood was required. One killing in particular raised his standing. A rival lieutenant had been extorting businesses that paid Masuria for protection. Masuria wanted the problem solved quickly, quietly, but with finality. Vito delivered. The man was found slumped in his car, shot cleanly through the head. No witnesses, no loose ends. Word spread. Vito Genovese could be trusted with the dirtiest jobs, the kind that required cold precision. But with every rise came enemies. Rival gangs marked him as dangerous. Law enforcement took notice as his name appeared in investigations. Though never convicted, his presence at the edges of violence became impossible to ignore. The newspapers began to speak of rising mafia violence in New York, hinting at names whispered in police files. Vito's star was rising, but so was the pressure. At home in Little Italy, life was changing too. Speakeasies flourished, jazz clubs hummed with music, and money flowed through the hands of gangsters like water. Vito, once a boy stealing apples, now wore sharp suits and carried himself like a man who knew the world belonged to him. But the ambition in his eyes was obvious. He wasn't satisfied with being a soldier or even a lieutenant. He wanted more. The Castellammare's war dragged on, claiming lives and reshaping alliances. For Vito, it was both proving ground and opportunity. He killed when ordered, protected routes, and built his own small empire beneath the chaos. Every move brought him closer to the men at the top. Every bullet fired brought him one step deeper into the life he had chosen. Law enforcement tried to break the gangs apart, raiding warehouses, arresting bootleggers, even planting informants. But Vito was always a step ahead. He knew when to vanish, when to keep his mouth shut, when to let others take the fall. To the police, he was a name on paper, a ghost that slipped away before they could pin anything down. To the streets, he was becoming a man to fear, a rising figure who understood both violence and survival. The city around him was changing, the country itself on the edge of transformation. Soon Prohibition would arrive, opening doors to unimaginable wealth and bloodshed. Soon the Mafia would rise from street gangs into empires. And standing at the edge of it all, Vito Genovese was ready. He had been a boy in Naples, a hungry immigrant in Little Italy. Now he was a man with fists hardened by fights, eyes sharpened by ambition, and a soul already touched by violence. The lessons were clear. America was not a land of opportunity, it was a battlefield. And Vito had no intention of losing. The year was 1920, and America was about to change forever. The 18th Amendment had gone into effect, making the sale and production of alcohol illegal. What the government imagined would bring morality to the nation instead created a black market more profitable than anything the underworld had ever seen. Overnight, liquor turned into gold. For the men of Little Italy, the timing could not have been better. They already had networks of smuggling, protection, and gambling. Now they had something everyone wanted: booze. Restaurants, speakeasies, and nightclubs all needed suppliers. Police and politicians, many of them heavy drinkers themselves, were eager to look the other way as long as the right envelopes landed in their hands. The stage was set for a new kind of empire. Vito Genovese was 23, restless and hungry. He was no longer just a tough kid running errands. He had proven himself ruthless in collections and feared in the alleys. Now he was ready for something bigger. The streets were flooded with opportunity, and Vito was not about to let it pass him by. At first, he worked under older gangsters who handled bootlegging routes. Trucks loaded with Canadian whiskey or homemade gin rolled into New York every night, and Vito rode shotgun, keeping an eye out for hijackers. He quickly showed a talent not just for muscle but for calculation. He knew when to fight and when to bribe. More than once, he pulled a driver away from a police stop, slipping money into the officer's hand with a cold smile. He understood that power wasn't only about fists. Sometimes, a folded bill was sharper than a knife. But violence was never far away. Rival gangs fought for control of the lucrative liquor trade. Trucks were hijacked, warehouses torched, men gunned down in broad daylight. Vito thrived in the chaos. He carried a pistol at all times and was never shy about using it. In one infamous dispute over a shipment of whiskey, Vito supposedly pulled the trigger himself, sending a rival sprawling on the pavement. The story spread quickly. This was a man who wouldn't hesitate, a soldier who knew how to deliver results. The blood in the streets only made him rise faster. By the early 1920s, he was no longer just a hired hand. He was running his own crew, small but effective, making money through bootlegging and gambling. His reputation caught the attention of powerful men higher up, bosses like Joe Masuria, one of the most feared mafia leaders in New York. Masuria was brutal, greedy, and feared across the city. He demanded tribute from all Italian gangs and used violence to enforce his will. For Vito, serving under him was both opportunity and danger. Opportunity, because Masuria's empire was vast, filled with money and connections. Danger, because Masuria's enemies were everywhere, plotting to cut him down. Law enforcement was watching, too. Prohibition agents raided speakeasies weekly, smashing barrels and arresting anyone they could grab. But corruption ran deeper than arrests. More often than not, those arrested walked free the next day, charges dropped, evidence misplaced. Vito saw how the system worked. Justice was flexible, and money bent it whichever way you wanted. He learned to keep cash ready not just for his men, but for judges, prosecutors, and anyone who could help keep him one step ahead of prison. Still, the streets never rested. The Italian gangs weren't united. Old rivalries from Sicily and Naples simmered in New York, feeding violence. By the late 1920s, tensions exploded into what became known as the Castellamarese War, a bloody conflict between Masuria and a rival faction led by Salvatore Maranzano. For men like Vito, this was baptism by fire. Murders happened daily. Men vanished, their bodies found days later in alleys or floating in the river. No one trusted anyone. Friends turned on friends, crews split apart, loyalty tested with every bullet fired. Vito fought on the side of Masuria, carrying out hits and defending territory. He was no longer just another soldier. He was becoming a trusted enforcer, the kind of man bosses relied on when subtlety failed and blood was required. One killing in particular raised his standing. A rival lieutenant had been extorting businesses that paid Masuria for protection. Masuria wanted the problem solved quickly, quietly, but with finality. Vito delivered. The man was found slumped in his car, shot cleanly through the head. No witnesses, no loose ends. Word spread. Vito Genovese could be trusted with the dirtiest jobs, the kind that required cold precision. But with every rise came enemies. Rival gangs marked him as dangerous. Law enforcement took notice as his name appeared in investigations. Though never convicted, his presence at the edges of violence became impossible to ignore. The newspapers began to speak of rising mafia violence in New York, hinting at names whispered in police files. Vito's star was rising, but so was the pressure. At home in Little Italy, life was changing too. Speakeasies flourished, jazz clubs hummed with music, and money flowed through the hands of gangsters like water. Vito, once a boy stealing apples, now wore sharp suits and carried himself like a man who knew the world belonged to him. But the ambition in his eyes was obvious. He wasn't satisfied with being a soldier or even a lieutenant. He wanted more. The Castellamarese War dragged on, claiming lives and reshaping alliances. For Vito, it was both proving ground and opportunity. He killed when ordered, protected routes, and built his own small empire beneath the chaos. Every move brought him closer to the men at the top. Every bullet fired brought him one step deeper into the life he had chosen. Law enforcement tried to break the gangs apart, raiding warehouses, arresting bootleggers, even planting informants. But Vito was always a step ahead. He knew when to vanish, when to keep his mouth shut, when to let others take the fall. To the police, he was a name on paper, a ghost that slipped away before they could pin anything down. To the streets, he was becoming a man to fear, a rising figure who understood both violence and survival. By the end of the 1920s, the war between Masuria and Maranzano neared its bloody climax. The city was littered with corpses, and everyone knew the conflict could not last forever. Men whispered that change was coming, that new leaders were rising who would reshape the very structure of organized crime. Among those whispered names was Vito Genovese. He was still young, but he had proven himself in fire and blood. The boy from Naples who once stared at the Statue of Liberty with defiance was now a man with blood on his hands, money in his pocket, and ambition burning in his chest. The streets had tested him and found him ready. The war had given him his chance. And as bodies fell and bosses plotted, Vito's eyes fixed on the future. He was no longer surviving. He was climbing. And the higher he climbed, the more dangerous the fall would be. By 1930, the streets of New York were drowning in blood. The Castellamarese War had stretched into its third year, and bodies piled up in alleys and cars like discarded trash. Newspapers called it a gangland slaughter. The police pretended to investigate, but everyone knew they were overwhelmed, outgunned, and often in someone's pocket. To ordinary people, it felt like a war without end. To men like Vito Genovese, it was the world he had prepared for all his life. Vito served Joe Masuria, one of the two powerful bosses at the center of the war. Joe the Boss, as he was known, was feared but also greedy, squeezing everyone beneath him for money and loyalty. He demanded total obedience and punished hesitation with death. To many, Masuria seemed untouchable. But Vito, watching closely, saw cracks. The man was losing ground. His rival, Salvatore Maranzano, commanded fresh troops from Sicily and had the patience of a general. Among the men closest to Masuria was a rising gangster named Lucky Luciano. Unlike the old bosses, Luciano saw the future differently. He believed the Mafia needed to modernize, to run like a corporation instead of a feudal kingdom. He was tired of the endless bloodletting, tired of being trapped in old traditions that limited money and power. Luciano began plotting not just survival, but revolution. And at his side were trusted men, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and Vito Genovese. Vito respected Luciano's vision, but what mattered most to him was opportunity. He was not sentimental about bosses or tradition. If Luciano's rise meant more power, more money, and a chance to climb higher, then Vito was ready. He had built his name as a ruthless enforcer. Now he was about to prove he was also a man who could be trusted with betrayal. In April of 1931, the plan was set. Luciano secretly arranged with Maranzano to betray Masuria. The deal was simple. Help remove Joe the Boss and Luciano and his men would be spared, even rewarded. It was a gamble, but one Luciano was willing to take. And he needed men who would not flinch when the time came. Vito was one of them. The trap was laid at a restaurant in Coney Island. Masuria thought he was meeting Luciano for lunch, but Luciano excused himself partway through, stepping outside. Inside, Masuria was left with his loyal enforcers, including Vito. Within minutes, the shooting began. Gunfire echoed through the dining room, shattering plates and glass. When it was over, Joe the Boss slumped forward, dead on the table, cards still in his hand. The murder shocked the city, but ended the war. With Masuria gone, Maranzano took control. For a brief moment, it seemed peace had returned. But Luciano had no intention of serving under another old boss who ruled like a king. Maranzano crowned himself boss of bosses, demanding tribute from all the families. It was the same system under a new face, and Luciano knew it could not last. Once again, he plotted. And once again, Vito Genovese stood ready to help. In September 1931, less than 6 months after Masuria's death, Maranzano was murdered in his own office, stabbed and shot by men disguised as police. Luciano's coup was complete. The old world of feudal bosses and endless wars was gone. In its place, Luciano established a commission, a council of mafia families meant to share power, settle disputes, and prevent another bloodbath. It was the birth of modern organized crime in America, and Vito was part of it. For his loyalty and ruthlessness, Vito was rewarded. Luciano trusted him as one of his top lieutenants, relying on him for enforcement and protection. Vito's reputation grew beyond Little Italy. He was now known throughout the underworld as a man who handled business without hesitation. If Luciano wanted someone removed, Vito made it happen. If a rival needed intimidation, Vito delivered the message personally. But his ambition was not satisfied. While Luciano dreamed of a new system built on balance and cooperation, Vito saw something else. He saw opportunity in the shadows, money and the vices others avoided. Luciano preferred to stay away from narcotics, believing drugs brought too much heat from law enforcement. Vito disagreed. He saw heroin and cocaine as rivers of gold waiting to be tapped. Quietly, he began building connections, testing markets, and setting the foundation for a future trade that would one day define his empire. Law enforcement pressure was constant. Prohibition agents raided warehouses, federal prosecutors threatened to indict bosses, and newspapers screamed about the Mafia's grip on the city. But corruption remained their shield. Police captains, judges, even politicians owed favors or took bribes. Luciano was careful, spreading money generously to keep the system running smoothly. Vito watched and learned, but also understood that the higher you climbed, the more eyes followed you. The law might be blind, but ambition made you visible. Still, for the moment, business thrived. Prohibition filled their pockets with millions. Speakeasies operated openly under their control. Trucks rolled in with liquor every night, and the Mafia grew into a machine. Vito enjoyed the rewards: sharp suits, fine cars, respect in every room he entered. Yet behind the calm surface, conflict brewed. Rivalries among the families never truly disappeared, and within Luciano's own circle, differences in vision widened. Vito did not care much for balance or diplomacy. He believed in strength in domination. And though he respected Luciano, he also knew that someday, the man at the top would fall. When that day came, Vito intended to be ready. One evening, years later, a friend who knew Vito from Naples remarked on how far he had come. Vito only smirked and said, "In America, you take what you want. If you wait for someone to give it to you, you'll be waiting forever." It was not just a comment. It was a philosophy, one that had guided him from the alleys of Naples to the heart of New York's criminal empire. By the mid-1930s, the Luciano family was the most powerful in New York, and Vito was one of its most trusted men. He had proven himself in blood and betrayal, rising with each body that fell. But power in the Mafia was never secure. Enemies circled constantly, rival families, ambitious underlings, and law enforcement determined to bring them down. The commission might have promised order, but order in the underworld was always temporary. Vito Genovese, once a hungry boy staring at America from a ship's deck, was now one of the most feared men in New York. He had played his role in reshaping the Mafia, standing beside Luciano as the old bosses fell. But in his eyes, this was not the end of a war. It was only the beginning. And as he sharpened his ambition, he also sharpened the knives he would one day turn against even those closest to him. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano had done what no one before him could. He tamed the chaos of the Mafia. The commission brought structure. Families shared power instead of destroying each other in endless wars. Businesses flourished: gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and the rivers of cash still pouring in from Prohibition's aftershocks. The underworld had become an empire, and Luciano was its king. For most men, serving at Luciano's side would have been enough. The money was steady, the power undeniable. But for Vito Genovese, satisfaction was never part of his nature. Ambition burned in him like a fever. While Luciano preached cooperation and balance, Vito wanted more. He didn't just want to share the table. He wanted to own it. The difference between them was clearest when it came to narcotics. Luciano believed drugs were too risky, too dirty. They attracted headlines, federal heat, and long prison sentences. Gambling made millions with far less attention. But Vito saw narcotics differently. He saw addicts lining up, dealers multiplying, and profits so large they dwarfed the gambling dens. To him, heroin and cocaine were the future. And while Luciano warned against it, Vito quietly built his own network. Through connections in Italy, Cuba, and South America, he began importing heroin, moving it through hidden routes, and distributing it in New York. The profits were staggering. Each shipment brought in money that outpaced the earnings of entire crews. Vito reinvested in businesses, bribed officials, and expanded his influence. But the more he built, the more attention he drew. Law enforcement had long struggled to pin charges on him. His name appeared in reports, whispered by informants, hinted at in investigations. But nothing stuck. Vito was careful. He never signed papers, never appeared at meetings that could be raided, never allowed his name to touch the surface of the dirty work. He lived in the shadows of his own empire, letting others take the risks. Yet prosecutors grew more determined. The FBI, still young as an institution, began collecting files, photographs, and testimonies. Vito's face appeared in dossiers labeled highly dangerous. The streets, too, grew more complicated. Other bosses resented his push into narcotics, fearing the heat it brought. Rival crews wanted a share of the profits, and disputes often ended in blood. Vito met each challenge with the same cold precision that had marked his rise. When a crew hijacked one of his shipments, 2 of their men were later found shot in the back of the head, their bodies dumped as a warning. The message was clear. Vito Genovese did not forgive, and he did not share. At home, he lived with the comforts of wealth. Sharp suits, fine cigars, expensive cars. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who knew fear followed him into every room. Yet his private life was no less ruthless. He married twice, both relationships marred by control and violence. Those close to him described a man who trusted no one completely, who demanded loyalty yet gave little warmth in return. Ambition had made him powerful, but it also made him cold. By 1936, the underworld shifted again. Luciano, the visionary boss who had created the commission, was arrested and charged with running a massive prostitution ring. Prosecutors, led by Thomas Dewey, pushed hard, using witnesses and headlines to build the case. Luciano was convicted and sentenced to decades in prison. For the Mafia, it was a thunderclap. Their king had fallen. For Vito, it was an opening. With Luciano behind bars, others stepped forward, Frank Costello as acting boss, Meyer Lansky continuing his financial genius. But Vito saw weakness in Costello. Costello was diplomatic, preferring politics, bribes, and influence in City Hall over violence in the streets. To Vito, this was softness. And softness in the Mafia was an invitation. Still, he bided his time. He continued building his narcotics empire, expanding into Harlem, Brooklyn, and beyond. His crews ran gambling houses, extorted businesses, and controlled unions. He grew wealthier, more feared, more untouchable. Law enforcement pressure mounted, but his lawyers kept him safe, and his witnesses either disappeared or changed their stories. But ambition does not come without risk. In 1937, a storm broke over his empire. Vito was indicted for the murder of Ferdinand Boccia, a man who had crossed him years earlier in a dispute over money. Boccia had been shot dead in a bar, and whispers tied the murder directly to Vito. For years, the case lingered without charges. But suddenly, witnesses came forward, indictments were filed, and prosecutors believed they had him cornered. The news spread fast. Headlines blared. Gangland boss indicted for murder. For Vito, it was a moment of reckoning. If convicted, he could face life or worse. He had survived countless raids and investigations, but this was different. Murder was not bootlegging or gambling. Murder was harder to bury. Rather than face trial, Vito made a choice that stunned even his closest allies. He fled. Packing his wealth, his family, and his ambitions, he boarded a ship and returned to Italy, the land of his birth. He told some he was only going temporarily, that the storm would pass. But everyone knew what it meant. He was running. To the world, it seemed a retreat. To Vito, it was strategy. In Italy, he still had connections, allies, and opportunities. Mussolini's fascist regime was rising, and corruption thrived just as it had in New York. If America became too dangerous, Italy could be a new empire. But his flight left scars. Allies in New York whispered about betrayal, about weakness. Rivals celebrated his absence. Law enforcement marked him as a fugitive, waiting for the day he returned. And though Vito believed he was moving forward, history would show that this was the beginning of his long decline. For now, though, in 1937, he stood at a crossroads. In America, indictments circled like vultures. In Italy, opportunity beckoned with both promise and danger. He had built his empire with blood and ambition, but ambition had finally forced him from the city he once swore to rule. The boy from Naples who came to America hungry for power had risen to the top ranks of the Mafia. He had money, respect, and fear at his command. But now he was leaving it behind, stepping into exile. What he did not know was that in Italy, the very ambition that had carried him this far would lead him into darker alliances, new betrayals, and a fall far greater than anything he had yet faced. When Vito Genovese stepped off the ship in Naples in 1937, he was not the poor boy who had left the city years earlier. He arrived dressed in fine suits, carrying money and confidence, a man transformed by America's streets. Yet beneath the silk and polish, he was still the same ambitious fighter who had learned as a child that survival meant taking what others feared to touch. Now, in exile, he looked at Italy not as homecoming, but as new territory to conquer. The country he returned to was under the iron grip of Benito Mussolini. Fascist banners hung from buildings, soldiers marched in the squares, and the regime's presence filled every corner of life. For most Italians, it was suffocating, but for men like Vito, it was opportunity. Corruption thrived even in dictatorship. Bribes greased the wheels of bureaucracy, and those with money and connections could live above the rules. Vito wasted no time inserting himself into this world. He moved into a villa near Naples, living like a man of status. He mingled with officials, businessmen, and even members of Mussolini's inner circle. His reputation from America, whispers of murders, bootlegging fortunes, and mafia power, followed him, and in Italy it carried weight. To some, he was an outlaw. To others, he was a man of influence who could make things happen. He even befriended Mussolini's circle, donating money to fascist causes and currying favor with local leaders. In return, he enjoyed protection. Italian police who might have otherwise looked at him with suspicion instead gave him space. Vito had traded one shield, the corrupt courts of New York, for another, the shadow of Mussolini's regime. But even as he settled into life in Italy, the world around him darkened. War loomed over Europe. By 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and World War II erupted. Italy joined the Axis, aligning with Hitler. The continent descended into chaos, and Vito, ever pragmatic, adapted. He used his wealth to secure his position, to ensure that no matter how the tides of war shifted, he remained protected. Back in New York, his absence was both felt and exploited. The indictment for Ferdinand Bocha's murder hung over him like a storm cloud. Prosecutors called him a fugitive. Newspapers painted him as a coward who had fled justice. In the underworld, rivals moved quickly to fill the vacuum. Frank Costello, the smooth-talking prime minister of the underworld, stepped into power. Unlike Vito, Costello thrived not through violence, but through politics. He built connections with city officials, union leaders, and even judges. His empire was quieter, less bloody, but no less profitable. For some, Costello's style was refreshing, a way to keep the mafia strong without drawing constant heat from law enforcement. For others, including those who had once followed Vito, it was weakness. In smoky backrooms and crowded clubs, men whispered that if Vito ever returned, he would reclaim what was his with force. But Vito was thousands of miles away, watching Europe burn. In Italy, he lived as both insider and outsider, wealthy enough to command respect, foreign enough to never be fully trusted. He saw Mussolini's grip tighten, saw the rise of rationing, saw soldiers march off to war. He maneuvered carefully, protecting his fortune, protecting his name. But fate was not finished with him. In 1943, the tide of war turned. Allied forces invaded Italy, sweeping up the coast in a campaign to topple Mussolini's fascist regime. The dictator fell, his power crumbling. For men like Vito, the shield of protection vanished overnight. Suddenly, being an ally of Mussolini was not an asset, it was a liability. American military authorities moving through Naples took note of Vito's presence. To them, he was not just another Italian businessman. He was a known gangster, a fugitive indicted for murder back in the United States. Soldiers and intelligence officers began gathering information, marking him as a target. His past had caught up with him, halfway across the world. In 1944, the blow fell. Vito Genovese was arrested by American authorities in Italy. The man who had once lived untouchable in New York's underworld, who had carried himself as a prince of Naples, was now in the hands of the very system he had fled. The indictment for Boccia's murder had not been forgotten, and now, after 7 years, justice was reaching for him. His arrest sent ripples through New York. Some rivals laughed at his misfortune. Others braced for his return, knowing that even in chains, Vito was dangerous. In Costello's camp, men whispered, if Genovese came back, war would follow. Yet fate was not straightforward. Witnesses in the Boccia case began to disappear. Some recanted their stories, others simply vanished. By the time Vito was extradited and brought back to the United States, prosecutors found their case crumbling. With no reliable testimony, the murder charge fell apart. In 1946, Vito walked free. For him, it was vindication. He had escaped the noose once again, slipping through the cracks of law and time. But his years in exile had changed the landscape. Costello ruled in his absence. Luciano, though freed from prison and deported to Italy, no longer held sway in New York. Lansky managed the gambling rackets with quiet efficiency. Vito returned to a city that no longer waited for him. He would have to fight for every inch of ground he wanted back. But fight was what Vito knew best. The years in Italy had not softened him. If anything, they had hardened him further. He had lived through dictatorship, war, and arrest. He had seen how fragile power truly was, how quickly alliances dissolved. Returning to New York, he carried himself not as a man humbled by exile, but as one determined to reclaim what he believed was his. The boy who had once left Naples for America had returned to Naples as a fugitive, only to be returned again by war and fate. And now, standing once more in the streets of New York, Vito Genovese looked at the city not with gratitude, but with hunger. He had lost time. He had lost ground. But in his mind, the story was not over. It was only just beginning. When Vito Genovese stepped back onto American soil after nearly a decade away, he was no longer just another gangster. He was a man with a reputation, an enforcer who had once stood at the right hand of Lucky Luciano, a fugitive who had escaped justice, and now, a survivor who had outlasted exile and war. For some, his return in 1946 was a shock. For others, it was a warning. New York had moved on without him, but Vito had no intention of fading quietly into history. The city he returned to was different from the one he had left. Prohibition was long over, but the Mafia had not faded. If anything, it had grown more sophisticated, more entrenched in the fabric of American life. Gambling dens still thrived, unions were under tight control, and politicians quietly pocketed Mafia money. Yet the landscape of power had shifted. Lucky Luciano had been deported to Italy. Meyer Lansky had turned his genius toward gambling operations in Havana and Las Vegas. And in New York itself, Frank Costello sat atop the Luciano family, running things with calm efficiency. Costello was no brute. He ruled not with bullets, but with influence. He cultivated judges, greased politicians, and made himself indispensable to Tammany Hall, the democratic machine that ran the city. His voice carried weight in boardrooms as much as back alleys. He was called the Prime Minister of the Underworld because his empire stretched beyond crime into politics and business. To many, he represented stability, the perfect balance between mafia power and public invisibility. But to Vito Genovese, Costello represented weakness. Vito had no patience for diplomacy, no respect for backroom handshakes. To him, power was not about smoothing edges but about cutting through them. He believed fear was stronger than influence, violence more reliable than politics. Costello's style might have kept the law at bay, but to Vito, it smelled of softness. And in the Mafia, softness was an invitation. Almost immediately, Vito began gathering allies. Some were old associates who remembered his ruthless efficiency in the 1920s and 30s. Others were younger men, ambitious soldiers who saw in him the kind of strength that could topple Costello's quieter rule. Vito spread money, whispered promises, and made it clear he was not back to serve. He was back to lead. Conflict between the two men simmered quietly at first. Costello extended an olive branch, offering Vito a seat at the table, a share of the wealth. But Vito wanted more than a seat. He wanted the chair itself. Tensions deepened as Vito began muscling into rackets Costello controlled, particularly narcotics, which Costello had avoided. Vito's drug trade flourished in Harlem and beyond, bringing in profits that dwarfed traditional gambling. Costello frowned, warning that narcotics brought too much heat. Vito ignored him. Money was money, and nothing was too dirty if it made him stronger. Law enforcement noticed his return. FBI files, which had once recorded him as a fugitive, now marked him as a renewed threat. Federal agents tracked his movements, listening to whispers from informants, noting every meeting. The New York District Attorney's Office reopened old files, looking for a way to bring him down. But, as always, Vito was careful. He stayed in the shadows, letting others take the risks. Still, his reputation alone caused unease. Judges remembered his name. Detectives who had worked the Bocha murder case shook their heads, muttering that they had let him slip away once and might never get another chance. In the papers, columnists wrote that a ghost from the past had returned to haunt New York. For Costello, the threat was not just Vito's ambition, it was the attention he brought with him. By 1947, whispers turned into open rivalry. Costello's men and Vito's men clashed in disputes over territory, unions, and gambling routes. Sometimes it was subtle, an intimidation here, a payoff there. Other times it was loud, fists in the street, bullets in the night. The Mafia, which had enjoyed relative stability under Costello, began to fracture under the pressure of Vito's hunger. Even outside the underworld, the rivalry drew notice. Politicians who had grown comfortable with Costello's steady hand grew nervous at the prospect of Vito's rise. Some reached out quietly, offering support to Costello. Others hedged their bets, making sure Vito knew they were not his enemies. Fear had a way of changing loyalties. For Vito, every conflict, every bribe, every whispered threat was a step closer to what he wanted. He believed patience was weakness. To him, the seat at the head of the family was already his, and Costello was merely keeping it warm. But Costello was not without defenses. His political power was unmatched, his influence stretching from New York City Hall to Washington, D.C. He had allies in high places, men who owed him favors and who would fight to keep him in power. Vito might have the streets, but Costello had the system. The two men represented opposite visions of the Mafia's future, one built on diplomacy, the other on fear. In private, old friends urged Vito to wait, to be patient, to avoid open war. But patience had never been his strength. He had not clawed his way from Naples to New York by waiting his turn. He had not survived exile by sitting quietly.
And he would not stop now.
In smoky clubs and dimly lit restaurants, men whispered of the inevitable, a showdown between Costello and Genovese. The Mafia could not serve two masters. Sooner or later, one of them would fall. For Vito, the path was clear. He had spent his life climbing, cutting down anyone who stood in his way. Costello was just another obstacle, another man too weak to deserve the crown. And so the stage was set. In a city where the Mafia ruled behind the curtain, two men prepared to fight for control. One with influence, the other with fear. The streets of New York had always belonged to the bold. And Vito Genovese was nothing if not bold. By the early 1950s, the quiet tension between Frank Costello and Vito Genovese had grown into something impossible to hide. In the beginning, it was whispered arguments over territory, gambling houses, and narcotics. But by now, it was open defiance. Costello, with his polished charm and political connections, still ruled the Luciano family. Vito, back from exile with years of hunger bottled up inside him, refused to play the role of loyal underboss. For a while, the Mafia world tried to keep the peace. The commission didn't want another war. New York had seen enough blood in the Castellamarese days. But peace requires compromise, and compromise was not in Vito's nature. Every year that passed, Every dollar that went into Costello's pockets instead of his own, not at him. He wanted not just influence but command. And the longer he waited, the more he feared time slipping away. Costello had allies in high places. Judges, politicians, union leaders, men who owed him favors and who believed his style of leadership kept the Mafia safe. But on the streets, his grip was weaker. Costello wasn't feared like Vito. He was respected, perhaps even admired, but fear ruled the underworld more tightly than admiration ever could. And Vito knew it. To make his move, Vito needed muscle. He found it in a young, hot-headed enforcer named Vincent the Chin Gigante. Gigante had grown up tough in Greenwich Village, a boxer with heavy fists and loyalty to Vito. He was the kind of soldier who didn't ask questions, just acted. In Gigante, Vito saw not just a weapon but a message. Costello's time was ending. On the evening of May 2nd, 1957, that message was delivered. Costello returned home to his Manhattan apartment building after dinner. As he stepped into the lobby, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Gigante, nervous but determined, a revolver in his hand. He raised the gun and fired. The bullet grazed Costello's head, tearing through his scalp but miraculously sparing his life. Blood poured down his face as he staggered inside, but he survived. Later, when asked by detectives who had shot him, Costello shrugged. "I didn't see nothing," he muttered. It was the code of silence, omerta, even when his life had been nearly taken. But survival didn't change the truth. The attempt had broken him. Costello was a man of influence, not war. He had built his empire on quiet deals and political handshakes, not on bullets. The attack showed him clearly. The game had changed, and men like Vito were no longer willing to wait. Within weeks, Costello announced his retirement. He stepped back from power, choosing life over the endless struggle. For Vito, it was victory. At last, he had what he wanted. The Luciano family, now rebranded under his name, became the Genovese family. It was the crown he had been chasing for decades, the throne he had risked everything for. In the underworld, whispers turned into recognition. Vito Genovese was boss. His rise was marked not just by ambition but by fear. He ruled differently from Costello. Where Costello had smoothed edges, Vito sharpened them. Disloyalty was answered with death, hesitation with punishment. His men enforced order with iron fists, and his presence carried a weight that silence alone could not defy. For years, he had dreamed of this moment, of standing at the top of New York's underworld. Now it was real, but with victory came pressure. Law enforcement, already rattled by the assassination attempt, now zeroed in on Vito. The FBI built thicker files, prosecutors dug deeper, and politicians who had once dealt comfortably with Costello eyed the new boss with suspicion. Unlike Costello, Vito had no soft edges. His involvement in narcotics was an open secret, and narcotics attracted federal attention like nothing else. Inside the Mafia, two cracks began to form. Some men welcomed his rule, impressed by his strength. Others resented his brutality, preferring Costello's diplomacy. Vito trusted few, suspecting betrayal in every corner. Even Gigante, the man who had carried out his orders, became both an asset and a liability. Gigante's reputation grew, and Vito knew ambition was a disease that spread easily. Yet, for now, the Genovese family flourished. Gambling, racketeering, construction, narcotics, all of it flowed under Vito's control. He demanded tribute from allies, punished rivals, and expanded his influence beyond New York. From Havana to New Jersey, his name carried power. He was no longer just a gangster. He was the Don. But his hunger for recognition went further. Unlike Costello, who preferred the shadows, Vito wanted acknowledgement. He wanted the world, even outside the Mafia, to know his power. In 1957, he demanded the commission host a grand meeting of bosses from across the country. The gathering, held in the quiet town of Apalachin, New York, would bring together dozens of Mafia leaders to discuss business, alliances, and the future of organized crime. It was meant to be a crowning moment for Vito Genovese, the boss of bosses, the man who had finally risen to the top of the underworld. But instead, It would become the beginning of his undoing. Because power, when flaunted, attracts more than fear. It attracts attention. And attention was something the Don could never afford. By the fall of 1957, Vito Genovese finally had everything he had ever wanted. Frank Costello was out of the way, lucky Luciano was exiled to Italy, and the Luciano family now carried his name. The underworld recognized him as a dominant force. But Vito wanted more than quiet power. He wanted recognition, the kind that no man could deny. He wanted the Mafia not just to whisper his name in smoky back rooms, but to gather under his shadow, to acknowledge openly that he was the one who ruled New York and beyond. It was ambition once again pushing him forward, the same force that had lifted him from Naples to Little Italy, that had carried him through betrayal, exile, and war. But now, instead of fueling his rise, ambition was about to lead him straight into disaster. The idea was simple: gather the most powerful mafia leaders in the country, from New York to Chicago, from Buffalo to Los Angeles, and hold a meeting to discuss business. The location was chosen carefully: the quiet upstate town of Apalachin, New York, far from the eyes of city cops and journalists. A local boss, Joe Barbara, owned a sprawling estate there. It was private, secluded, surrounded by woods. On paper, it seemed perfect. But power is loud, even when it tries to whisper. On November 14, 1957, cars began arriving at Barbara's estate. Big Cadillacs and Buicks with out-of-state plates rolled into the driveway, one after another. Inside them sat the giants of organized crime. Bosses, underbosses, consiglieri, all summoned by Vito Genovese. More than 100 mobsters gathered that day, their presence a visible map of the American underworld. They came to discuss narcotics routes, gambling profits, and disputes that had long needed resolution. They came to hear Vito speak, to watch him flex the authority he believed was his by right. For Vito, it was supposed to be the crowning moment, the day he showed that the Genovese family wasn't just one of many, it was the heart of the Mafia. But what he failed to see was that such a gathering could never remain invisible. In town, neighbors noticed. So many expensive cars, so many unfamiliar faces. Local police officer Edgar Croswell, a man with sharp eyes and little patience for outsiders, grew suspicious. He began watching the estate, noting license plate numbers, calling in reinforcements. Soon, dozens of state troopers surrounded the area. Inside, the bosses ate steaks and drank fine liquor, oblivious to the storm building outside. Then the alarms came. Police were swarming the roads, blocking exits, closing in on Barbara's estate. Panic spread through the gathering. Men scrambled for the doors, some rushing into the woods, others trying to drive past the barricades. In their expensive suits, running through fields and trees, the most feared men in America looked less like kings and more like cornered thieves. Over 60 mafia leaders were detained that day. Some were questioned, some arrested. Newspapers across the country seized on the story. Photos splashed across front pages showed mobsters in handcuffs, their silk suits stained with mud, their faces twisted in shame and anger. For decades, law enforcement had struggled to prove the Mafia even existed in an organized form. Now, thanks to Apalachin, the truth was undeniable. The Mafia was real, national, and powerful, and its leaders had been caught together, exposed for all the world to see. For Vito Genovese, the disaster was personal. He had called the meeting. He had demanded it. And now, instead of cementing his place as the supreme boss, he had handed law enforcement the biggest gift they could have dreamed of. The FBI pounced. Files were expanded, surveillance intensified, wiretaps approved. Politicians who had once dismissed the idea of a national crime syndicate now had to admit it existed. Committees in Washington called hearings, dragging mobsters into courtrooms, demanding answers. The Mafia, once able to deny and deflect, now found itself in a spotlight it could not dim. Inside the underworld, anger simmered. Many bosses blamed Vito directly. His hunger for recognition had endangered them all. Instead of showing strength, the Apalachin meeting showed vulnerability. It proved that even the most powerful could be caught off guard, running like schoolboys from the police. Men who had once respected Vito now saw him as reckless, blinded by ambition. Still, he tried to spin the disaster. To his own men, he insisted the meeting had been necessary, that no one could have predicted the police interference. He spoke with the same confidence he always had, but even his closest allies saw cracks. They saw a man who had reached too high, and in doing so, had shaken the entire foundation beneath him. Law enforcement pressure tightened. Indictments followed, some dismissed, others dragging on. Vito himself faced questioning, though as always, he denied everything. He claimed he had been at Barber's estate for a simple visit, nothing more. Few believed him, but proving otherwise was not simple. He walked free once again, but the walls were closing in. The streets of New York began to murmur. Costello's old allies mocked him quietly, saying the so-called Don had embarrassed himself and everyone else. Rival families, like the Gambinos and the Luccheses, weighed their options carefully. They had once feared Vito as a man who killed first and asked later. Now they saw someone whose ambition had weakened him. Yet for all the fallout, Vito did not retreat. That was not his way. He doubled down on his narcotics empire, moving heroin through international routes, flooding American cities with drugs. The profits were still enormous, but so was the attention. Federal agents began tracing shipments, flipping low-level dealers, connecting dots that led higher and higher. Each connection drew closer to Vito's name. In public, he carried himself with the same arrogance as always. He walked into clubs, restaurants, and meetings as if nothing had changed. But in private, he grew more paranoid. He knew enemies surrounded him, not just in law enforcement, but within the Mafia itself. Men who had once sworn loyalty now whispered of betrayal. Some wondered if the Genovese family might be stronger without him. By the late 1950s, his reign, though still feared, carried the weight of inevitability. The disaster at Apalachin had marked him. It was not just a blunder, it was the turning point where his rise crested into decline. From then on, every move he made was shadowed by suspicion, every success overshadowed by the disaster that had given the government the proof it needed. For the first time in his life, Vito Genovese had climbed so high that there was nowhere left to go but down. And the fall, when it came, would not just strip him of power. It would leave him alone, broken, and betrayed, the tragic ending to a man who had once dreamed only of ruling New York. The Apalachin meeting should have been the peak of Vito Genovese's career, the day he proved himself not only as the boss of the most powerful family in New York, but as the figurehead of the entire American Mafia. Instead, it was the day his empire began to rot from within. The humiliation lingered like a shadow, poisoning his reputation. The police had stormed what was supposed to be his coronation, and the whole country had watched the Mafia scatter like frightened boys. For the first time, Vito carried with him not just fear but doubt. In the underworld, perception was everything. A Don was strong only so long as men believed he was invincible. And at Apalachin, he had been exposed. Still, he did what he always did, he doubled down. He had built his fortune on narcotics, and now, more than ever, he leaned on the drug trade to keep his empire afloat. Heroin flowed into New York from Europe, smuggled through Cuba and South America, distributed in the back alleys of Harlem and Brooklyn. The profits were staggering, but they came at a cost. Unlike gambling or loans, narcotics brought relentless attention. Federal agents could ignore dice games. They could not ignore heroin flooding American streets. The FBI began closing in. Files on Vito thickened with each passing month. Wiretaps picked up whispers of shipments, payoffs, and bribes. Informants, small-time dealers arrested with packets of heroin, began flipping, trading information for lighter sentences. Slowly, a web of evidence began to tighten around him. Inside the Mafia, cracks widened. Some of Vito's allies were tired of the pressure his leadership brought. They had lived comfortably under Frank Costello, when the mob moved quietly, shielded by political deals. But under Vito, the glare of law enforcement was constant. Even his closest lieutenants began to wonder if his hunger had cursed them all. The final blow came in 1959. After years of investigation, federal prosecutors brought Vito to trial on narcotics trafficking charges. Witnesses, some of them former allies, took the stand. Evidence, traced carefully through international routes, pointed back to him. For once, the old tricks, bribed jurors, missing witnesses, clever lawyers, weren't enough. The world had changed. The government was no longer content to let the Mafia operate in shadows. The trial was relentless, the headlines brutal. Newspapers that had once called him a mystery man now painted him as the architect of the heroin epidemic. For decades, he had slipped through the cracks, beating indictments, walking away from charges. But this time, there was no escape. The jury found him guilty. The judge's sentence was merciless: 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The Don of New York, the man who had dreamed of ruling it all, was led away in handcuffs. Prison stripped him of the trappings he had built his life around. The fine suits, the expensive cigars, the respectful whispers, all gone. In their place were cold walls, routine counts, and the stench of confinement. Other inmates, some who had once feared his name, now watched him shuffle through the yard like any other convict. Guards, unimpressed by his past, treated him as they treated all the rest. The king had been reduced to another prisoner, bound by rules he could not bend. In prison, Vito tried to cling to dignity. He received visitors, gave orders through carefully coded conversations, pretended that his influence still reached beyond the walls. And to a degree it did. His family, now the Genovese family, remained powerful, operating under trusted lieutenants. But even there, his grip weakened. Men like Tommy Eboli and Anthony Fat Tony Salerno rose within the ranks, steering the family while Vito sat in his cell. The longer he remained behind bars, the more the family belonged to others. He aged quickly in prison. The man who had once commanded fear with a single glance grew thinner, slower, plagued by health problems. His voice, once sharp and confident, became hoarse. Guards noticed him spending long hours alone, staring at nothing, as though replaying the choices that had brought him there. Worse than the illness was the betrayal. Men he had trusted, men who had sworn loyalty, now made deals without him. Some quietly celebrated his downfall. Others cut ties, protecting themselves from the heat he had brought. In the Mafia, power was never truly loyal. It followed strength, and Vito no longer had it. By the mid-1960s, he was a relic. The world outside moved on. The Mafia adapted, shifting operations, changing faces, staying alive even as the FBI grew stronger. But Vito remained stuck, a prisoner not only of stone walls, but of his own ambition. In 1969, at the age of 71, Vito Genovese died in prison from a heart attack. The news spread quickly through the underworld. Some remembered him as a giant, a man who had clawed his way from Naples to the top of New York's underworld. Others remembered him as reckless, a boss whose greed had nearly destroyed them all. In the end, his story was not one of triumph, but of tragedy. He had risen higher than most, commanding fear, wealth, and power. But every step upward had come at a cost: betrayals, rivals, indictments, exile. And when he finally reached the peak, when the throne was his, it lasted only briefly before crumbling beneath him. He died not as the untouchable Don he had always imagined, but as a prisoner, sick and forgotten by many who had once called him boss. And yet, even in death, his name lingered. The family he once ruled still bore it. The Genovese family, one of the most powerful crime families in America. His shadow lived on, not in triumph, but as a reminder of what ambition without limits can cost. Vito Genovese's story was a cycle as old as history itself, a man who rose from nothing, seized everything, and in doing so, lost it all. The boy from Naples who dreamed of power had achieved it. But like all men who hunger without restraint, he had been consumed by it. In the silence of his final years, in the loneliness of his prison cell, he became what he had once feared most: ordinary. Just another man waiting for the end, his empire carried on by others, his legacy shaped not by victory, but by downfall. And so the Don who ruled New York left the world not with a roar, but with a whisper.